Let us start Discourse Analysis. Gabriele Griffin, University of York. Gabriele, spelling of Gabriele is Gabriele, Griffin, University of York. And the name of the chapter is Discourse Analysis, chapter number 6. This chapter is taken from the book Research Methods for English Studies, edited by Gabriele Griffin. Introduction. Discourse analysis is concerned with the investigation of language, both written and oral, and it is actually used as opposed to an abstract system of structure of language. It is different from textual analysis, see chapter 9 in this volume, in that it assumes from the outset that language is invested, meaning that language is not neutral, a tool for transmitting a message, but rather that all communicative events. 1. Dijik, 2001. Whether these be, for instance, reading of novels, plays, poetry, and a notice on a billboard, a conversation or an interview, constitute a particular way of talking about the understanding of the world and as an aspect of the world. Phillips and Jorgensen, 2002. Both on the part of the producer, the writer and the speaker, and on the part of consumer, the reader and audience. As such, discourse analysis refers both as a theory of language use as not neutral but invested, and a method of analyzing language in use. Discourse analysis has two components. One is the investigation of pattern in language use. For instance, the kind of personal pronouns used, such as I or we, by an individual speaker, narrator, and the impact for this on the authority status of the speaker, narrator. The other relates to the pattern of language use as activity or process. For instance, how much verbal space a speaker occupies in conversation. The aim of discourse analysis is to produce an analysis or explanatory critique, Fairclough, 2001, of how and to what purpose language is used is invested through the deployment of specific textual features, lexicon, grammatical, semantic. In order to facilitate understanding of its effects and possibility of resistance to that investment, it thus explores the link between language use and socio-cultural practices. Philip and Jorgensen. The term discourse itself has multiple meanings. See Mills, 1997, especially pp. 1-26. Thus, it may refer only to spoken word or to all utterances written and verbal, to a particular way of taking, delineating a specific domain with its own particular vocabulary and set of meanings, such as legal discourse, medieval discourse, scientific discourse, medical discourse, scientific discourse. Discourses may also refer to a specific set of statements within a given context, a regulated practice with accounts for number of statements. Foucault, 1972. Such a religious discourse for sermon, for example, or fairy tales, which have definable characteristics and features established and maintained through the regulations that govern what you can and cannot utter as a part of these genres or sub-genres, and how can you articulate it. Thus, the conventions of the fairy tale allow it to begin with once upon a time, but not with beloved in Christ, an opening more appropriate to a sermon. Discourse thus simultaneously makes certain utterances possible while surpassing others. Discourses also produce different kind of truth claim or effects. Thus, we understand fairy tale both as made-up stories or fiction, and as myth, and the opening once upon a time signals the commencement of a certain kind of story that we do not expect to be literally true, but which, as fairy tales, delivers inter alia a particular sort of moral message. If a priest or a vicar were to start her sermon on once upon a time, this would create interdiscursivity, the mixing of different discourses with different types of truth claims. That in turn would destabilize her narrative and raise question about its truth value, since sermons are intended to convey partly a literary truth. For example, Christ died on the cross and arose again after several days of burial, and partially a moral message. To start a sermon with once upon a time would undercut the literal truth element of the sermon and render questionable the truth if effect a sermon is meant to produce. In the time of the angels, Irish Murdoch captures the imperative of the discourse of sermon hilariously and tragically in the exploit of the figure of Carol Fisher, rector of St. Eustache, Watergate, who has lost his faith in institutional religion. He introduced curious variations of his own into the ceremonial of his services and even into the liturgy. He began a sermon by saying, "And what if I tell you that there is no God?" and then left his conversation to fidget uneasily during a long silence. He once conducted a service from behind the altar. He was given to laughing in church. Murdoch, 1978. The novel here portrays the normative structure of discourse, showing that discursive framework demarcate the boundaries within which we can negotiate, meaning Mills, 1997. By raising question about the existence of God, Carroll stepped outside these boundaries. The except from the novel indicate a further aspect of discourse, namely that it assigns subject position both to the speaker narrator and to the listener reader. Carroll's boundary violations regard the subject position he should adopt. Metamorphically, by affirming the existence of God, and especially by speaking from in front of the altar, lead to unease among the congregation who do not know how to respond to these transgressions. Discourse then has meaning, force, and effect within a social context. Mill, 1997. In this instance, in a relation to the congregation, hence the emphasis in discourse analysis on the impact or effects of discourse in social. Carroll's boundary violations signal the extent to which discourse normalizes or naturalizes certain discursive conventions through their iterative performance, to the extent that only at the point of violation may we become aware of the existence of those norms. Part of the effect of discursive structure is precisely such naturalization, which serves to reinforce the boundaries between different kinds of discourse and introduces the notion that change involves violation in what has described as the order of discourse, that is, limited range of discourses which struggle in the same terrain. Philip and Jorgensen, 2002. One example commonly used for such struggle is the contest between traditional and alternative medical discourses. Such struggle concerns the dominance of a specific discourse in a given field and indicate that the hegemony or preeminence of a given discourse is not set in stone but achieved through struggle and therefore subject to change. One such struggle and change can be observed in feminist appropriations of the certain literary forms such as fairy tales. Texts like Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber have served both to highlight the gendered conversation that govern traditional fairy tale and to explore the truth claim these make about relations of the power. For instance, between the wolf and Little Red Riding Hood, the change in perception of that such appropriations have brought about both in relation to the genre in question and in relation to its truth claim signal or a key aspect of discourse to be mentioned here. The fact that it can be the object of the change through being used in different way from what is normally the case. Effective contestation of specific discourses result to socio-cultural change, and discourse analysts are partly concerned with how such change can be brought about. Access to discourse is not equally, Mills, 1997. In the episode from the Murdoch's novel, for example, Carroll speaks while the congregation sits in silence. Similarly, in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, the fate of the fallen woman, Maria, is conveyed not through her narration but via her merger of the omniscient narrator's voice with the reported ruminations of Sir Thomas. Mansfield Park's infactual patriarch It ended in Mrs. Norris resolving to quit Mansfield and devote herself to her unfortunate Maria, and in an establishment being formed from them in another country, remote and private, where shut up together with little society. It may be reasonable suppose that their temper become their mutual punishment. Austin, 1966. As such silence of women considered to have disgraced themselves in common in 19th century novel, providing insight into the portrayal of social structure during the period. An example above show texts such as novel both are and portray discourses and may be analyzed in terms of both these dimensions. Sarah Mills cited John Frohusitz. The discursive is a socially constructed reality which constructs both the real and symbolic and distinction between them. It assigns structure to the real at the same time as it is a product and moment of real structure. Mills, 1997. It is for this reason that Philip and Jorgensen, 2002, argues that the analysis of discursive instance should include an analysis of the discourse and manner articulated in the production and consumption of the text, an analysis of the linguistic structure, considerations about whether the discursive practice reproduces or instead restructure the existing order of discourse, and about what consequences that has for the broader socio-cultural practice. The analysis of textual features such as narrative voice, who speaks, grammar, wording, and also provides insight into the way in which texts treat events and social relations and thereby construct particular version of reality, social identities, and social reform. Philip and Jorgensen, 2002. Varieties of discourse analysis. As a brief outline of various versions of discourse analysis that are currently commonly used shows, see for example Mills, 1997, Philip and Jorgensen, 2002, Vetheral et al., 2001. Discourse analysis situated on an interaction between linguistic and social theory. See Kress, 2001. Has come to the fore as a research methods in 1970 in the number of humanities and social science disciplines, including linguistic, literature, sociology, psychology, and politics. In all these different subject variants of the discourse analysis have been produced that reflect their disciplinary context and related theoretical assumptions. Wetherell et al., 2001, distinguishes 6 distinct discourse analytical research traditions: conversation analysis and ethno-methodology, interactional socio-linguistics and ethnography of communication, discursive psychology, critical discourse analysis and critical linguistics, Bakhtinian research, and Foucauldian research. So these are the 6 points I am reading again, and these are distinguished 6 distinct analytical research traditions. I repeat, in all these different subject variants of the discourse analysis has been produced and reflect the disciplinary context and related theoretical assumptions. Vetheral et al. Distinguishes 6 distinct discourses analytical research tradition. Number 1, conversation analysis and ethno-methodology. Number 2, interactional sociolinguistics and ethnography of communication. Number 3, discursive psychology. Number 4, critical discourse analysis and critical linguistics. Number 5, Bakhtinian research. Number 6, Foucauldian research. These traditional share certain traits, in particular their focus on language use as subject of research. The assumption that language is not a neutral means for conveying a message but rather shapes our perceptions of the world. What such shaping takes place within the hierarchical structure of the power, which are both formulated and upheld by language, and can also be changed through the changing use of language, and that actual use offers possibilities for change or resistance to demand to dominant discourse through being situated and at a particular moment in time and particular context. At the same time, these traditions differ in the terms of the degree to which they view the world at partially or wholly constructed through discourses. The type of discourse they focus on, for example, written, spoken, naturally occurring, discursive or non-discursive, institutional. The assumptions they make about the enunciating subject, that is, extent to which they ascribe agency to the subject in having or not having control over his or her language use, and what change or he or she may be able to generate through that use, and opposed to subject being viewed as objects of and constructed by discourses. Their focus on the structure of discourse or its effects, the context in which they analyze discourse, the knowledge they seek to produce. These issues can be persuaded by the reader via Wetherell et al. 2001. The point of mentioning all these there is to indicate that discourse analysis is not a unitary research method, but one that takes different form of different contexts dependent upon the research on wishes to conduct and within what academic discipline. Discourse analysis as a research method also continued to evolve. In the following, I shall predominantly draw on the critical discourse analysis associated inter alia with the linguistic normal Fairclough, for example 1989, 1992, 1995 and 2000, Chauliaraki and Fairclough 1999. In order to discuss what kind of research one might conduct using discourse analysis, what kind of knowledge discourse analysis produces, and what some of the issues are related to the use of discourse analysis as a research method. Critical discourse analysis. Fairclough's version of critical discourse analysis, CDA, distinguishes discursive form from non-discursive dimensions of communication and is concerned with the way in which discourses act to produce the change the world. It attempts to engage critically, hence critical discourse analysis, with the discourses produced by dominant institutions such as government in order to show how the texts they produce recreate particular version of the world. For example, Fairclough 2000 and Van Dijk 2001. Fairclough's critical discourse analysis is thus also a theory of subject and of an agency, in that it is concerned with the relationship between language, the subject and social process, viewing the subject as capable of influencing perception of the world and thus for changing things through this is her use of language. Following Fairclough are Bodak 1997, Philip and Jorgensen 2002. Identify 6 common features among the diverse version of critical discourse analysis that exist. The understanding that language and discursive practice, how texts are produced and consumed, contribute to the constitution of the world. The notion that discourse is both constituted by and constitutes the socio-cultural world. 3. The focus on actual language use within a given context as the object of research. 4. The notion that discourse is invested and contributes to the reproduction of power relations to society and to the interpretive scheme operating within a given society. 5th, the notion that discourse is historically situated, hence contingent and subject to change. 6. Demand that discourse analysis should be concerned with the critical examination of language in order to promote change. Language thus simultaneously refer to the world and construct it through imbuing it with particular meaning. When Jane Austen, in the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice 1813, claimed that it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife, she not so much proclaimed a neutral and subjective fact of the muster her rhetorical force to offer a particular construct of a specific kind of single man. That rhetorical force set out both to view a certain view and simultaneously and implicitly disavow that ways of seeing. It thus seeks to set up Austin's particular view of a single man as the only way of viewing him, without, however, making that explicit by referencing either an author or a narrator figure through qualifying the statement by a phrase such as, "in my opinion." Austin's rhetorical resources include, for example, the use of the present tense and indicative verb form "it is," which suggests that fact that underscore validity, followed by a truth claim reinforced through the adverbial, adjectival assertion and generalizability. Truth universally acknowledged. In order to lend persuasiveness to her view and assert the normativity of the position that would not necessarily be shared, for example, by gay men who might be single and in possession of a good fortune but not in want of a wife. Thus, while constructing a world of normative heterosexuality, Austin's introduction simultaneously attempts to close down the possibility of other ways of reading the situation of a man in the position described. Here, we are already in the midst of discourse analysis which at this brief example demonstrate involve the close textual analysis of the linguistic and a semantic feature of the text. In order to establish the meaning the text seeks to impose on the world by and implications on the reader, such as analysis may focus on a small segment of the text or, as far as more common, range over a large amount of text, from a brief paragraph to all the plays and by the attributed to Shakespeare, or the entire output of a particular journal, magazine, or newspaper such as Edinburgh Review. The term used to describe large set of text and data such as the litteris corpus and corpora in plural. However, rather than merely describing a text's linguistic features, the purpose of discourse analysis is to reveal how such features set up and replicate particular worldview. Thus, the fact that Jane Austen describing a single man in possession of good fortune as in want of wife and opposed to, for instance, friends, indicates the commitment to marriage, and the text seeks to promote its focus on heteronormativity. The kind of knowledge discourse analysis may then produce is an understanding of the implicit rule and norm that govern language use in a specific context to make explicit and ideological assumptions that govern that use, and by making the latter explicit to point to possibility of resistance or other ways of reading. As Robert Scholes, 1982, suggested, we need to view the literary text as a product of a person or a person, at the product of a person or persons at given point in human history, in a given form of discourse, taking its meaning from interpretive gestures of individual reader, using the grammatical, semantic, cultural codes available to them. One effect of this is that discussions of discourse and of the discourse analysis tend to focus on text in area that produce ideological contention. Mills 1997, for instance, discusses sexist and racist discourse as a way of laying bare the operations of language used in articulation of particular value system. Similarly, Fairclough in New Labour, New Language 2000 seeks to reveal how manipulating language to control public perceptions is a vital aspect of New Labour politics. We are all familiar with the ways in which the language of business and institutions seek to represent problems as opportunities to provide a positive and supposedly energizing spin on a difficult situation. Many special issues of discourse and society have been devoted to the ways in which contentious political situations have been variously and contradictorily presented in the different discourse politicians and other employ to influence public opinion. What kind of text? This brings us to the question of what kind of text might be analyzed using discourse analysis within the frame of English studies. Hence, the first thing to note is that while English studies has sometimes been narrowly viewed as the study of literature, that is, the study of high literary form of a set of specific authors' work. The question of what is literature, and indeed what its purpose, is raised particularly vigorously in the since the canon debate of the late 1970s and early 1980s has itself become the matter of contestation. The effect of this has been that the field of English studies at the beginning of the 21st century has attempted to encompass all manners of text and by all manners of writers who were not part of the canon of literature that formed the backbone of a teaching of English literature until the mid 1970s. For example, in 1980s, particularly the 1990s, there was a turn in English literature towards science. This was promoted by the drive of public educational policies towards enhancing the public understanding of science. A part of the demise of the welfare state and promotion inaugurated under the conservative government of Margaret Thatcher and continued under the Labour government of Tony Blair to consumer choice and individual responsibility. This term has meant that different kinds of text from science, including from the fields such as medicine, biology, zoology and anthropology, have been revisited by English literature scholars in order to explore the interrelationship between the kind of narrative we produce about our world in different domains and the impact that these narratives have. One need only think of the work such as Gillian Beer's Darwin's Plot and Jonathan Swart's The Body Emblazons Dissections and the Human Body in a Renaissance Culture, 1995, to recognize the impact of this term to science on the English studies as a field. Discourse analysis as research method of the English studies may then not be confined to the study of literature as a high cultural form, but can be applied to many different kinds of text, including not least verbal ones such as interviews with the writer. For instance, in her chapter on ethnography in this volume, Rachel Alsop, for instance, briefly discusses the ways in which cultural critique Mary Louise Pratt has described ethnographic narratives as either utopia or dystopia, depending on their narrative arch and on how the ethnographic position him or herself in his or her narrative. Studies of ethnography as text in specific narrative structure may well then, and indeed do in the context of travel writing, for instance, from part of what might be termed English studies. The point is that field of English studies has widened considerably during the past 30 years or so. The kind of text a researcher working with discourse analysis as a research method might focus on thus depends on the knowledge her or she wants to produce. He or she may be focused on high culture text, but it is not restricted to these.